Book of Eradan, Chapter 3. A small layer of snow blanketed the tops of the trees making up the Chetwood, the flakes of snow finding it hard to reach the forest floor, where Eradan, now following a lone path from the Great East Road, winding its way through and up to the small hamlet of Archet. Unlike most who enter the forest of the Chetwood, Eradan kept his ranger senses keen and ever aware for the slightest of movement, subtle signs of covered trails or tracks, anything that may indicate danger. Although close and frequently visited by hunters and foragers from Bree, Stadel, Combe, and Archet itself, the Chetwood was as old as any of the wood throughout Middle-earth, and dangers lie hidden all around. Archet was quiet, like it always had been, the occasional sound of chopping or sawing of wood, and the low neighing of the various beasts of burden, pulling carts full of packed wood and lumber heading off towards Bree. Eradan entered the village proper without fanfare from the handful of Archet residents, barely acknowledging his presence, and Eradan was okay with this. Reaching the green Fletcher Inn, Eradan tied up his horse and walked in. "Find yourself a seat, I'll be with you," the innkeeper half-heartedly spoke from behind the small bar. Eradan noticed they hadn't looked up towards him, and scanning the room, no other patrons were present. Eradan noticed the hanging specimens along the walls, and sitting down towards the back and near the fireplace, looked at the closest set of antlers, and let out a slight chuckle and a grin. "Well, Falco, you sure leave your mark wherever you go." Eradan pulled back his hood and set his sheathed sword within arm reach of him. "Well, what have you?" The innkeeper now standing across from Eradan. Eradan noticed a sense of confusion, wondering what to make of him. "Ale, and whatever you have cooking in the pot. That's all that's needed." Eradan nodded and then motioned to the set of antlers hanging on the wall behind him. "And this? What is this for?" The innkeeper looked and then motioned around the room. "Official record of the hunt. That one there? Well, just new from last week. Surprised we were, being a hobbit and all. Came in barely being able to carry it." Eradan looked back at the antlers and again smiled, now turning his head back to the innkeeper. "Well, he is full of surprises." Eradan now taking off his gloves and laying them back on the table. The innkeeper now with even a further puzzled look towards Eradan. "Ah, so you know Falco, eh?" The innkeeper continued to eye Eradan, but with less of a puzzled look and more intrigued. "That I do." "Well now, about that food and drink?" Eradan curtly asked. "Yes, well, it won't be long." The innkeeper gave a slight smile and shuffled to the kitchen. Eradan turned around again and looked back at the antlers brought back by Falco. He turned and looked towards the fire and sat back into the chair and waited. Eradan left Archet the same as he entered, with little fanfare or awareness that he was even there. He proceeded northward towards to what the locals called the Dead Man's Dyke, but to all rangers, it was Fornost Erain, the once great ancestral center of the Dunedain, before the destruction at the hands of the Witch King of Angmar. Eradan had a sense of anticipation, hearing of the great city of stone, but never seeing it, as he galloped on his horse along the rolling hills and glades, as the great forest of the Chetwood thinned out. Eradan passed many homesteads that dotted the land surrounding the village of Bree, some seemingly seeing much better days than before now. By the second day, the last signs of any Greenlander faded, and the wild areas and boundaries of the north downs was coming into view. Eradan found himself a suitable place to camp, hidden within a cleft of bedrock in a well-sheltered shallow valley. Fortunate to not have seen any signs of ruffians or other ill-intended creatures like orcs, goblins, or the like. Morning of the third day to Fornost Erain, he spotted a peculiar path leading out of the valley, and without his careful eye trained by the experienced rangers with which he learned his craft, he wouldn't have spotted it. But the telltale signs of marks signaling a path frequently used by his brethren marked a path through the wilds, heading north toward the old city. Eradan felt fortunate of his finding, and the sense of dread in the encroaching shadow within his mind appeared to dissipate, and the light of his was a little brighter. Eradan followed the path northward, never losing sight of the markers, left only to be seen by the most trained eye of the rangers. Any other would not have noticed, unless they too were taught the ways. Miles he traveled north, The weather was fair, the sun hung low in the sky, the wind, although chilled, ever so slightly. By later afternoon of the fourth day, low, grey-black clouds rolled in from the north, and Eradan felt the cold, bitter winds now blowing harder down and through the valley. Eradan quickly found a place for the night, out from the bitter winds and blowing snow, the fire he did manage to light barely giving off any appreciable heat. The night was not restful, for Eradan didn't know if it was the now raging blizzard he found himself in, or the darkness that was slowly encroaching the lands of late. Visions and thoughts of hopelessness, disaster, ruin came over him. He hadn't felt this way before, and it was being so far from the angle and his family that caused it so? Or was some power here trying to corrupt his mind? He wrapped himself further into his heavy, fern-lined cloak and threw more wood into the fire, now staring into the red, yellow, and orange flame, hoping the light would push out the darkness. What little rest he got, he hoped it was enough to keep going. The storm passed on and left a heavy blanket of fresh snow throughout the land. The winds had died down, the clouds lifted slightly, but still the grey black of the sky remained. The air was still and silent. Eradan secured his gear on his horse and guided his horse out of and northwards. His horse now bucked and neighed in fear, seemingly sensing something not well with where they were. Eradan tried his best to calm the horse down, and when he saw what spooked his horses so much, the blood in his body seemed to have drained out like that of water rushing over a high fall. Although the Dunedain have no special senses to feel the passing of kin, the feeling that now overwhelmed him brought forth darkness and sorrow. What evil was in the land darkened the entire place, and what shadows were in the valley in which Eradan found himself in were long and dark, the air bitterly cold. A thin blanket of snow obscured most of the body he saw, with only the leather boots showing out, just enough for him to see. He brushed away what snow was there, and suddenly he felt the urge to vomit wave through his abdomen. As he turned and his head away, holding it back, covering his mouth with his gloved hand. A moment passed, the urge faded, and he turned his head back. The body of a slain Dunedain lay before him, mutilated, almost unrecognizable if it weren't for the brooch, in the shape of a rayed star, loosely held the mangled cloak together. Eradan studied the body, adjusting for the previous blizzard, the bitter cold. Eradan thought that the ranger had succumbed to his wounds only a handful of days earlier. Eradan paused and thought if only he had pushed the group faster from Mount Graham, cutting the trip back to Bree by a few days, he may have been here to thwart whatever killed the Dunedain, now laying here, lifeless. The wounds showed the telltale signs of orcs, deep, serrated cuts, and a shaft from a crudely made orcish arrow. Eradan closed his eyes for a number of moments, and upon opening them, he now had the small brooch in his hands. Nothing he could do for his brother now, and a sense of sorrow again came over Eradan, the last of the Dunedain dwindling further and further. Eradan stood, more resolved than ever now, to reach Fornost Erain, and then across the hills of the North Downs and east towards Mount Graham. The charge given to him by Lady Gilrain to find whatever he could of any orcish movements must be completed. If orcs are further venturing this close to Bree, and worse, the Shire, nothing good would come, Eradan thought. The ground was now too frozen to properly bury the body. Eradan had no choice but to leave for the wilds to reclaim. Pocketing the brooch, he would return to the home of the rangers and find out who this ranger was, for he could not recognize or remember who it is. Eradan continued north, and after a number of miles, the ruined walls of Fornost Erain, barely visible with the accumulated fresh snow, came into his view on the horizon. Eradan entered the ruined city, what was left above ground at least. The hands of time have ravaged the abandoned city, destroyed by the invading Witch King and his forces from Angmar, now almost 1,000 years ago. If it weren't for the fading memories and dwindling numbers of the Dunedain, and the handful of elvish Loremasters, few would recall the history of the once capital of Arnor, and later Arthedain. Every ranger knew of the ill-fated last of the Númenórean kings of the sea. Arvedui, after the fall of Fornost and Arthedain, lost his life in the frozen ice bay of Foreshell. Fornost Erain was a sacred place, and it was every ranger's charge, if near it, to protect the pass as much as possible, waiting for the day that the return of the king would come and bring honor and glory back into this ancient realm. Eradan pressed into the ruins, now dismounted, guiding his horse through the maze of deep snow, broken walls and ruin, and twisted trees. Although the Witch King was ultimately defeated by the last alliance of elves, men, and even hobbits a millennia ago, Eradan continued, the winds of the north now howling in eerie sound through the many protruding clusters of ruined walls and statues of the once great walled city. More and more the sound howled, the winds blistering and cold. He tightened his cloak more around him with one hand while holding the reins of his horse in the other. Without warning, a large crack and a shudder from underneath his feet he felt, and slowly, like that of sands in an hourglass, the snow started to fall into a newly made hole, and he along with it. Eradan gathered his wits and quickly dug himself out of the piled snow that now buried him into a darkened chamber. Gathering his bearings, Eradan stood and looked at what and where he fell into. What grey light from the outside came in made visible to Eradan a vast chamber, which nature, until now, had not yet broken through completely, its large stone walls and large tall pillars that supported the semi-dome ceiling. Eradan marveled at the architecture, never before seeing such a wonder created by men before. Even the halls of Rivendell paled in comparison to its beauty and workmanship. Whatever craft and stone masonry that had built this, now long since been forgotten to the passing of time. Eradan eyed, now fully adjusted, spotted the long, high pedestal in the far end of the hall, with which then sat a large throne. As he carefully walked further towards it, carefully navigating the maze of fallen stone and debris on the floor, he spotted the image of a single, mini-rayed star, the high marble back with which it was unseemly untouched by the passing of time. Eradan pulled out the small brooch from the fallen ranger he had saw earlier, and the resemblance was the same. He stood near the marbled stone throne and placed his hand on the star underneath his breath. Is this the throne of Arvedui, last of the kings out of the sea? His thoughts of remembrance now shifted to puzzlement. How was he to get out of here? The hole in the ceiling created the fall into the chamber was some 30 feet high or so. He could hear his horse quietly neighing above, and the rope he did have was securely strapped to the saddle. No good that did him. He looked around the room for whatever doorways that would have lead out and or into the hall, but whether by design or by time, all the entrances were blocked with piles of stone and other rubble. Not all was lost, however, as he stumbled upon a relatively large sealed box, and upon carefully opening the lid, found a number of surprisingly preserved maps. What light of the day availed of him, he saw the map showed of places of the Old Kingdom, of Arthedain and Arnor. Eradan smiled, and realizing the importance of such a find, and carefully placing it in his pack, he would ensure it was safely taken back to Rivendell, to Lady Gilraen. Surprise came over Eradan as a voice came from above, and with it a length of rope down into the hall. "Come, I'll pull you up," a man yelled from above, and although he could not make out the features of his would-be help, save for the silhouette of the cloak about him, Eradan knew he wasn't meaning ill of him. Grasping the rope, and within moments Eradan was up and on the outside, now staring face to face with another ranger of the north. "I wasn't expecting another of us to be here, this late in the year. The name's Talendil, and I've been on watch over this place for many years. What brings you?" Talendil, his tall and imposing frame square to Eradan, reached out his hand in greetings. Eradan reached out his hand in return, embracing it as he would any other member of the Rangers. "I am Eradan, and on a charge from Lady Gilraen herself to scout the northern borders of our reach and bring back whatever knowledge I can of orc or other evils that try to venture further in. I've come now from the Chetwood, after delivering a handful of captive free peoples from Mount Gran, and I am to return there to finish my task and then back to Rivendell." Talendil stepped back now and motioned Eradan to follow him, now guiding him around and out of the ruins of Fornost Erain. I'm not going to lie, Eradan. I had hoped that Gilrain would have heeded my ask for more men, to help reclaim these lands as we once had, as Southerners have pushed us further and further south into the east. If what you say is true, that orcs and others are increasing their numbers near Mount Graham, I too share the fear that some nefarious plot builds that would do us ill. Talendil, saying solemnly. Eradan nodded. I am afraid I have other news. I found this on one of our own, neck just south of here. Maybe you knew who it belonged to. Eradan removed the small brooch from his belt pouch and handed it over to Talendil. Talendil looked at it, the mini-raid star, and took in a deep sigh. I had not heard from Adrahil for some time, and this was his. Our numbers are getting too thin, Eradan. We may not be able to protect this region much longer. Do you know what had slain him? Talendil solemnly saying to Eradan and pocketing the brooch. Orcs, I'm afraid. And not 2 or 3 days, no more than a week earlier, said Eradan. Orc? This far south, and at this time of year? These tidings do not bode well at all, Eradan. And with one less to us to guard this place in the North Downs, I fear for whatever free peoples reside here. Talendil, now at one of the ruined outer gates of the north wall, turned now and looked at Eradan. Come, let us rest for the evening, and set you on your journey back to Mount Graham and then to Rivendell. I will tell you more of what is happening here, and then with your charge advise Gilrain of the same. Maybe with her counsel, more can be done. Eradan nodded his head in agreement. Farewell, Eradan, and make haste. Their winter will not be kind, I'm afraid. Talendil motioned to Eradan as he turned and left back into the city. Eradan responded in kind and then turned to face the wild of the North Downs, a rolling landscape of intermittent rocky outcroppings, scattered trees and open glades. Snow, which was to stay now until spring, covered the ground, and Eradan was thankful he had his trusted mount. Having studied the maps found in the chamber earlier, and with Talendil's aid, Eradan figured he'd reach the north boundary of the North Downs in 4 days, then turn east and to Mount Graham in 9. Weather and fortune permitting. Rangers of the north were prepared as any to brave the wilds, even in the most inclement of weather, but caution was always to be had. He would only push himself as far as he reasonably could. The clouds were dark and grey, and a chill wind blew from the north. Eradan hoped for the winds to change, but that would not be his fate. By midday, a snow started to fall, and visibility was at a minimum, and his progress moved to a snail's crawl. The winds blew hard, the snow cutting deep into his clothing. His horse labored with the now ever-increasing snow. It seemed all evil was bent on holding him back and never to move forward. Finding what he could within the confines of a handful of old, wind-bent trees, he stopped and dug out what he could a resting spot. Nestled against his mount, he slept as best one could given the howl of the winds, the bite of the cold, and the wetness of the ever-falling snow. Morning came, and with it the passing of the storm. Eradan and his horse had been buried in snow, but not enough to cause issues with breaking free of it. He was but a handful of leagues north of Fornost Erain, and Eradan was dismayed at the progress he had made so far. With the fairer weather, he had hoped to make up the loss of time. He pushed ahead, northwest, through the downs. The snow remained deep, and begrudgingly his horse waded through the snow. Fortunately for Eradan, his horse, although not the most of strength, fared well due to its light stance and relative weight. The horse suddenly stopped and pulled back, turning around quickly. Eradan held on tightly, almost losing grip and balance and falling off. He calmed the steed, and then when he looked to see what set it off, he now noticed it. Eradan now found himself at the edge of a deep and unexpected ravine, the edges obscured by the white snow, the lack of appreciable sunlight making it harder to see. He patted down the horse in thanks, and proceeded along the ravine edges a number of yards to the side, not chancing a fall into a sudden crack in the rock or loosening footing and falling into it. The boundary to the north end of the downs was marked by the sudden cut of the tree line, the expanse of the lowlands to the north looking flat, desolate, with the occasional grove of gnarled, twisted, and bent trees breaking up the monotony. Not with a handful of men would Eradan traverse the land at this time, for the old kingdom of Angmar, under the power of the Witch King, soured the land, and the evil and darkness still permeates it. Eradan turned his attention now eastward, and towards Mount Graham of the Edenmoors. The way was extreme, with days of cold, bitter winds blowing from the northlands. Periods of blinding snow and large sky reaching drifts, slowing his progress. Eradan pushed through, finding resolved in the charge given him by Lady Gilrain to find the information and bring back to her to Rivendell. He would ensure that the task was done. On and on he continued, stopping for rest periodically, always keeping to the move, through the snow and the bitter winds. Fortune seemed to favor him as he neared the foothills of the Edenmoors, Mount Graham now within 2 days' ride. Signs of orcs and hillmen from Rudar encampments not that long ago. Trails now leading from the north to the east and towards the mountain. Eradan took note of where this was in his mind, and he continued on. The sun on the 8th day rose low over the misty mountains to the south, unable to warm the winds now continuing to blow from the north. Eradan's provisions of breads, dried meat, and the like were now dangerously low. He prepared his bow and kept an ever-keenful eye on any signs of wild game to be had. Hours passed, and fortune once again favored Eradan, as he spotted and felled some large hares, with thick fur, heavy meat, and fatted bellies. By evening, the meat was prepared, and fur and skin now removed and tied to the saddle. Eradan ate well, and for the next day he would reach Mount Graham, and, needing all the strength he could will, for who knows when he would have a well-prepared meal again. Eradan now peered out over the now charred remains of the bandit camp he had helped destroy a little less than a month ago, and noticing no signs of activity or attempts to rebuild. What of the troll Moog? He could not tell. The opening to its cave bare, no noise to be heard. He pulled out the ragged map he had pulled off the would-be leader's body and studied it, and noted a number of paths leading up and into the mountain. Taking mental note, he tucked it away and proceeded. Although rangers brave the wilds of Eriador alone, there are times when having a close companion near you is most welcome. Eradan felt that the time was now, but he took in a deep breath, swallowed, and bravely moved forward. Slowly he traversed the maze of hills, gullies, and gorges at the immediate foothills of the mountain, at times having the foreboding sense that he had turned back on himself and reached the same place not just twice but multiple times before. A sense of ill will with loss and dread came over him. But the words of his people, the charge from Gilrain, and the seeing of the many-rayed star and the throne of Arvedui pushed back the encroaching darkness into his mind. He pressed on, using his senses to guide his path forward. Hours passed, but he was making progress, now finding himself in a narrow gorge, when suddenly, and without warning, Eradan heard the sudden and loud sound of cracking and breaking rock, and as he looked up, huge boulders and large rocks and other debris fell towards him, bouncing and breaking off the walls of the ravine. Eradan's heart sank, and taking in a deep breath and covering his head, he jumped. If you like the story and the content I'm creating, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Also, check out my other videos called Riddles in the Dark, where I attempt to review and describe the rules of the One Ring RPG for new and experienced players alike. And check out my Substack, a companion to this YouTube channel, where I'll be posting various behind-the-scenes information about the campaign, session notes, and other items related to the game. You can find the link in the video description below. Thank you for watching. Cheers.